My full name is Elizabeth Greenwald Fogel. I was born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland. But my father died when I was 9, and I spent a lot of time in Trenton, New Jersey with my grandparents. But I came back to Baltimore and was married in Baltimore. It was arranged among friends, and he was visiting a friend. He was visiting in Baltimore. And then I remember after we were going for a while, this friend of mine said, "You were just lucky. Somebody else was asked first and she wouldn't go on a blind date. So you are lucky that it worked out the way it did." I said, "Well, yes." That was before the war. He was in the reserves. He had been in the reserves for years at the old reserve building here in Georgetown. The Navy called him back before Pearl Harbor, and he was in training in Washington before Pearl Harbor. And so we courted then when he was already in the Navy. And we were married in March 41, and he was transferred to the Naval Air Station in Norfolk. And of course, the wives went there. And it was a wonderful duty. War was declared, and within 2 weeks, he was gone. And he was gone to Honolulu in the first convoy that went, a tremendous convoy of doctors and nurses and all the supplies that they needed for Hawaii. And he was gone. He left in that. He was in the same patrol wing that he had been in Norfolk. They packed them up, and they all got on the ship and went to Hawaii. They landed, should I tell you about? They landed in Hawaii, and he said it was the worst sight, that he hoped he never saw anything like that again. And it was just tragic. Well, they got off the boat, and they were ordered back on the ship. Apparently, the patrol wing that had guarded Hawaii had not been at fault. So they sent him back to the San Francisco and the Bay Area, and we stayed for 18 months. And he called me as soon as he got back in San Francisco. Said, "I've got to look for an apartment, come right away." We lived in Alameda. Well, I loved it. We would be back and forth over the bridge to San Francisco all the time. Yes, it was a wonderful duty. So then he left for duty overseas, and he was gone 18 months. And I packed up and went back to Baltimore to stay with my family. It was over in 45 for us, He was stationed at that time in Boston, and we were living in Boston. And we moved back, and I had never lived in Georgetown. We moved to Georgetown in December '45, just in time for Christmas. I lived with his family, and then we lived on Broad Street. We built in 1953, I think we moved in, on the corner of Prince and Greenwich Drive. My architect, we must have done her in, because I think she's a Presbyterian missionary or something now. The brick came from Charleston when they tore down the orphans' home in Charleston. My husband got the first large load of old brick, and the brick had come over from England as ballast and been placed in the orphans' home in Charleston. And that location was where Sears Roebuck had been, and then that was torn down, and they've college dormitories or something for the College of Charleston. The first store, I don't know the exact location, but it was on the other side of the street. Is that the west side of the street? So the east side, and it was somewhere on the end of the 700 block, I think. This store was a different building, and the second floor was the Opera House, originally. Yes, his father, my mother, and she helped him with it. Harry and Clara Fogel were his parents. And then during the war, he had a sister, Beatrice, who really ran the store when he came. She and her husband. That was Beatrice Fogel Kaufman. I think he was really in the hotel, and then he found it was very difficult switching from one business to the other. And so finally he had to switch over to the store. You know, in the hotel, you know, Bernard Baruch never had a telephone. He never had a telephone at Hopco. People can't believe that. He made all his calls in the payphone at the Prince George Hotel. And he would pull up and have a car full of guests. And I remember, I guess it was Luella Parsons with this big hat sitting in that car. I was just fascinated. I mean, you never knew who was sitting in that car. All these famous people. And then he'd go in and make his calls to New York.
And did they get out of the car and come in?
No.
What did they do?
They just sat there and waited for her. Sometimes some of the men got out. My husband had, in his day, met some very interesting people. But one day when I lived on Broad Street, the doorbell rang, and there was Bernard Baruch. "Miss Fogel, could I please use your phone?" I said, "Of course." So he came in and went in the den, which was right there. And then my 2-year-old just marched in and stood right there next to him. Thank goodness he didn't open his mouth. He just stood there looking at this big man. And I'd peep around the corner and be sure everything was all right. And he didn't move. He just stood there looking at this man. And I don't know what Mr. Baruch thought of it, but everything worked out fine, and he made his call. And so I appreciated his coming to the house. That was nice. Yes, he did. Well, because he knew most of the old families that owned the plantations that had come here, and like the I read somewhere where the Montgomerys came in 1923. That was very early. And we went to dinner at Little Hopcaw. Well, Little Hopcaw was lovely. He had really fixed that up for Elizabeth Navarro. It was really beautiful. And we were both invited for lunch because he wanted my husband to hunt with him. And so we went. They had flown in steaks from, where was his friend who, St. Louis, was it? And over the mantel, I used to paint. Over the mantel was the painting that she said Winston Churchill had given her that painting that he had done in North Africa, and it was beautiful. There were some gorgeous antiques, and she told me that where he had bought one at the big auction house in New York. And because I think I'd admired that. But it was a very interesting day. Everybody, most of them shopped at Fogel's, and I remember when the Red Sox won, whenever they won, and we had Red Sox all over the windows. I couldn't figure out where they could put another Red Sox. Well, it was what we called, I guess, a family-owned store, similar to many small towns, but it got to be a very big store because, well, even in the 50s, Myrtle Beach was fairly small, and a lot of Myrtle Beach people shopped in Georgetown because they couldn't find these young, famous brands that the young people wanted. But it was still a special town store. He would go off and buy, you go off and buy your merchandise. Our competitors did too. But, and then he made me go, I had to go.
And where?
And we'd go to Charlotte, and sometimes we'd go to Atlanta. But as long as our salesman went to Charlotte, we went there. But went to, I guess, set the style. I've heard men say, I'm still wearing the suit. Well, we closed the doors in 1984. And my husband hadn't been in there, in a couple of years. And I see today they've had to close family stores all over South Carolina. Some of the stores I know of because they shopped when I shopped, and who knew them. Hazel Weiss was a very good customer and a very reliable customer and very dignified. I mean, I never saw her, but she had an account there, and her girls were always coming in. They were instructed. They had to be very well behaved, and they were. I never knew who they were. They were tremendous sheep customers. That place was famous up and down the coast. Did you know that? I had heard stories about somebody way off. Oh, I knew Hazel's. It was just amazing. But she had a good reputation for what she did. It was allowed to remain until one of the sheriffs suddenly closed her. But she had gotten old, and that might have had something to do with it. Maybe, I hate to say this, but politics are crooked. Maybe she paid people off, and that's how she stayed in business. I don't know, but I know that it had gotten to whoever followed Garris Cribb. Harry Fogel was very much part of that because he felt this was a sick town before the paper mill came here. And the paper mill really did change. And I think there was no hotel here. And I think a couple of the officials, when they came, stayed with the Fogels and stayed with other families to encourage them to come. He was very much interested in the progress of the town because the town of Georgetown was struggling terribly. Terribly. Anytime they were going to close, you worried when you were in business. Someone would say, who come here, how do you stand the smell? Well, it smells like gold to me. There was no bedroom communities around, and Pawleys Island was just the very small, very few families. The Lashcuts and 3 or 4 other families, and the Marlows. But what I want to tell you, this is Historical Society. I came here, and one of the first houses I walked into was, at that time it was the Snyder, Fanny Snyder's house. I've forgotten what her husband's name was. I walked into that house. The proportions were so 18th century. Here I was in Georgetown in an 18th century house. I was so excited. And then, of course, years later, she passed away. And I heard the city was going to tear the house down and make a parking lot. And my mother had moved here to an apartment out at Indigo, I think that's the name of it. And I told my mother, if they'll tear that house down over my dead body. I cannot imagine tearing that house down. It's gorgeous. She told Dr. Camlin, who was her neighbor and friend, and he bought it and did wonderful restoration of that house. So I can't say I saved that house. My mother saved that house by opening her mouth that I would die if something happened to that house. I watched him really restore that house. That house, when you turn the corner of the porch, they had so much family, but they had a bathroom there. It was at the end of the dining room. When they tore that bathroom off, Dick Camlin said to me, look, all he did was open the shutters, and there was the window from the dining room facing the porch with the original siding on the house, the window, everything. It was just, there were so many things in that house that she had cared about and hadn't destroyed. It was amazing. And then when Russell Wright came to help try to save Georgetown, he came, I guess, for the Historical Society. And so I was asked to go through the house with him. And I remember he went up to the attic and he said, look at this. And he pulled through the boards and there was pine straws insulation. It was still there. It's on Prince Street. And across the street, I think houses, old houses with the historic, were my thing. That's what I loved. Across the street was the small house, had been the Levy house. And a small, what we call a single house. They're both Charleston single houses. The typical, it's a center hall house, but the center hall swings to the lot, and the narrow end of the house, usually the living room, faces the street. And that's a typical single house that they have in Charleston. Watched them tear down houses, yes. And I couldn't do anything about it. Yeah, I watched them tear down houses. But a lot of houses were saved. Prince Street has a lot of houses. We were just a small town with water on 3 sides. That is a blessing to me today for Georgetown, in that it can't grow. I went to Arundel a lot. I painted at Arundel. And I was a close friend of Lou Quattlebaum. And she came to Charleston, to Bishop Gadsden. She died there. And I was, let's see, Arundel. And next door was Chicorwood. Well, the Constances are friends of mine. Old Ralph Ford used to take guests of brook fishing. And he was my neighbor at Pawleys Island. And he saw me fishing off the dock. And he invited me to go fishing with him. That was a great honor. And we got in the little boat and went out to sea. I didn't get seasick then. It was later. And we went out to sea, and we were doing fine. And all of a sudden, I caught something like a sailfish. It sailed out of the water. Oh, he couldn't believe it. And then he told me what to do, and I brought that. It wasn't particularly big, but it was a sporting fish that it is very rarely seen around here. Can you imagine me catching that on that trip? It was, and I took a picture of it in front of the beach house. No, they told me I had to get out at the town in the heat. So the first summer, I stayed at the beach, and I stayed from then on.
Where did you stay then?
I stayed on the north end in the house that is now the CO house, was my house. And I had that house until just before Hazel. I sold it to the COs just before Hazel. From recycled from the boarding house, 3 houses were built on Pawleys Island from an old boarding house in Georgetown. I think that was her boarding house. And these houses were all well built. They're still here. I rented it from Catherine Hayes, and the first year, and we liked it. My husband gave it to me for a present. And the insurance company replaced the roof so much that when we sold the house, they bought it. They knew how well, they knew the roof was perfect. So the COs bought it, and they're still there. I don't blame them. Because we had built in town, and my husband said, "Don't you want to sell the beach house?" See, Tad had started going off to camp and not being there in the summer, and we rented, and I wasn't happy with cleaning up after a renter. And he said, "Don't you want to sell the beach house?" And that house was sold to the COs before the old yes got out of my mouth. First, I stayed in town because it was pretty breezy. We had a big dock. You know, it's on the water. And it was very cool, but I missed the beach. So we stayed at Casino Inn for about 3-4 years when George was little. George was a baby, we were there.
And who owned Casino Inn at that time in the 50s when you were staying there?
And that was wonderful. What food! Oh, and what's their name? The two of them, Hope and Hyatt, were just wonderful, and the food was just terrific. And we stayed there. Well, I guess we stayed there almost probably till 59. I know in 60 we built this house. George was 5 years old. And so we've been here ever since. The name of this is Seacliff, and my accountant was Clifford Bell. So the name of this is Seacliff. It was high up anyway. But you know, there's another, I don't know whether it's Seacliff, but Clifford Thompson had a house there. But that's much younger than this house. It was a 50-foot lot, and this house sits on a 50-foot lot because it's a wide porch. And when I first built it, this was an open atrium, and we closed that. It's made a tremendous difference because when we have two generations, one generation can be on the porch. The younger generation stays in here, and we'd stay on the porch. I mean, younger generation grown up. I picked this because I felt this was more suitable than the other one. But I think I showed the other one to Julia Kaminsky. Somehow in my mind, Julia said, "Betty, that's not gonna work." And I knew it wasn't gonna work. It just was, well, it was even simpler than this. So, isn't it funny that I remember her and those plans? So I must have shown them to her. Julia Kaminsky owned it, and then Calhoun Lemon must have bought it from her. And then as long as I've lived here, the Lemon family has owned it. And they were related to my neighbors who owned the Pawley house for years, the Calhouns and the Bartolds. Well, they were related to the Calhouns. That was a wonderful relationship for my children, the Calhoun children. They were just all the same age. They had them every age, so they fitted in perfectly with my children. When I came to the beach, it was different. You saw different people here in the summer, but in those days, people didn't come over here as much. But in later years, I had big parties on my porch, and I had all my town friends. And it's different now. And people dress now. I liked it when you came in your bare feet. That was a different life in the old beach house. When the creek man came to the back door and you lived on all that seafood that was out of this world. You could get the flounder and the crab and the shrimp and the oysters all summer. Lucille, we called her Wea. She was great. She came down there, but then I had different people here from town. And they could get the bus back to town after I moved here. They could get a bus. I had one who was raised on Pawleys Island. She was a Pawleys Island cook. They don't make them like Pawleys Island. Pawleys Island cooks are just wonderful. The old-fashioned way, as long as they teach their children. That is, if their children are willing to learn. Smith. Yes, her husband was Mr. Georgetown.
Mr. Who?
Georgetown. He really started out with a singing group that used to sing for the Mansfield Singers. That was her husband. What was his first name?
Henry? Henry Smith?
Henry Smith. That was Henry Smith was her husband. She was wonderful. She worked for a lot of people in Georgetown. We had left home and moved into Sister B's house, where George lives now, 815 Prince Street. We went to stay there. And then I went back, which was only a few blocks away, to finish securing more things so nothing blew around. And the police came and says, "Governor says you've got to leave." I said, "I've already left. I'm just here moving some stuff." Well, that didn't even suit him. He couldn't believe that I'd already left and just. So we went there in the middle of the night. My husband woke up and the trees were blowing and heaven knows what was happening outside. He said, "We never heard wind like this at home." Well, when we went home to our house at 125 Greenwich Drive, there were 25 trees down in the yard, and the water had not come in our house, but it had just come up to it. And I went in the house to check, and suddenly somebody came in the front door. I said, "You can't come in here." I said, "This is a closed house." But see, they wanted to look and see if there was any damage. There was no damage in the house. Everything in the garage that I had put the golf clubs up high had ended up on the floor. My husband had to take them to somebody at the jail who reconditioned the clubs. My clubs were just in a mess. I just gave them to my granddaughter. I guess the next day, only owners were allowed in here. No one else could get on the island. And by the time I had passed Tip-Top, and it was slightly Tip-Top, and so I was really ready to cry then. I said, "It's gone, I know it's gone." And we came up here and there was water, from the creek all the way up here. And I came in and we looked and the house was here and the glass wasn't broken. We always tied the front door. We always hooked the door open and tied the screen door open so the wind could go through, which it did. And it was flat out here. The dunes were gone. The walkway was totally gone. It was pretty awful. But we were very lucky. The house was still here, and the water had gone in the downstairs room, which had been added on. But even though we were high up, I mean, it still came in, but see, we were high enough up with this, but we had lost the dunes. So when there's a storm, the first thing we call is, how are our dunes? That's the first thing we check on. That's so important. We were really amazed, and we were very thankful because our losses were tremendous. In the store building, which was closed, I've forgotten who had everything in there, was just flooded. Never happened before, ever. And apparently it had damaged across to Belks, to that side of the street. But see, we were on Prince Street at another level. It didn't get up to the cars. My car was parked between the two houses on Prince. It was not touched. We were in our house at 125 Greenwich Drive in Hazel, and we stayed there in Hazel. We had just sold the beach house. And I remember Hazel came in from the west, because I remember leaking from the dormer upstairs to our floor. And that was not long after. We never had another leak, ever, after that.